and colleagues of our center, and also anyone from other universities and organizations. We're glad to have you this morning. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to just explain once again how our webinar will work. It's be the same as all the other ones if you've been to one in the past. Our center. So Dr. Patock-Peckham will be presenting her slides on the screen. We'll have video and voice, and a selection of our attendees are listed as panelists that can have their video feed on if they want. Everyone else is attendees and will not have video. We ask that everyone keep yourself muted and turn off your microphones until there's time at the end if we're asking questions. At the end of the talk, we do expect to have some time for questions. Typically, the way we've done this is it's a moderated Q&A. If you have your questions, you can submit them directly to me in the chat window, and we'll sort of triage them and ask them at the end. Julie, just so you know, you don't have to monitor the chat window throughout the presentation. We'll do the questions at the end. We won't probably have time to get to everyone's questions just because of time constraints, but we'll try our best. I do want to thank Sergey, Archana, and Drew for their help, as always, with coordinating and logistical support for the seminar series. We do have one more seminar talk remaining this semester, so I'll just ask Sergey when he gets a chance to put the link to our events page, and you can also follow us on Twitter for updates on our center activities and our seminars and all the other events we have planned for this semester. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Julie Patock-Peckham is an assistant research professor in the Department of Psychology at Arizona State University, where she's also an honors faculty member at Arizona State as well. She received her MA and PhD in psychology from Arizona State, and previously held faculty positions at Baylor University and Missouri University of Science and Technology. At Arizona State, she's the director of the Social Addictions Impulse Lab, which you can see on your screen, the SAIL Lab. And their work focuses broadly on understanding root causes of alcohol use disorder in emerging adulthood. She's published over 40 papers in the addictions field, and she sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Studies on Alcohol and Drugs. And her work is currently funded by a K01 grant from NIH and IAAA. Today, Dr. Peckham will be presenting the Behavioral Impaired Control over Drinking, Exploring Acute Stress, a Priming Dose, and Childhood Trauma with Self-Administration Methods. So Julie, the floor is yours.
Good morning. So I'm very delighted to present Behavioral Impaired Control over Drinking, Exploring Acute Stress, the Trier Social Stress Test, a Prime Dose, and Childhood Trauma with Self-Administration Methods. I just want to show you what our lab looks like. The student in the corner is Felix Munoz. He is a quantitative PhD student. He helped me build this lab from furniture kits, very inexpensively, by the way. This was an old office we turned into a bar. We were lucky enough to get a TV so that when people are clearing out, they can enjoy themselves. I do want to introduce some very special people that are very dear to my heart. Miss Jessica Canning helped me build the SAIL Lab from the ground up. She is Mary Larimer's senior graduate student at UW right now. The fabulous Ariana Ruoff is still helping us with our cortisol analysis. She's a doctoral student in family studies at ASU right now. Below me is Heather Smythe. I owe her a deep level of gratitude. She spent an entire summer teaching me multi-level modeling along with Dan McNeish at ASU. Alondra Cruz was my session one supervisor. She is now a doctoral student at UCLA working with Craig Enders, so she will be a multi-level modeling expert as well. To her right is Sean Naldi. He was one of my bartenders, and he works at Barrows Institute right now, and he's doing a fair amount of writing with us, and we're very excited about that because he is a fabulous editor. Today I'm going to talk about impaired control over alcohol use. I'm sort of obsessed with this concept. It reflects continued drinking despite intentions to limit consumption. Impaired control is one of the earliest symptoms of alcohol dependence, yet very little is known about the contexts that are most likely to result in loss of control over drinking. Just to give you some history of this construct, Jelnick, way back in 1960, was talking about gamma alcoholics who exhibited a loss of control and an inability to abstain from alcohol use. Chick in 1980 literally noticed that many of their subjects expressed no intention to control their drinking at all. Bickle and I might call this impulsivity instead of impaired control, but that's up for debate. There really is a gold standard trait measure of impaired control over drinking from Nick Heather, which measures 3 distinct parts. Part 1 is failed attempts to reduce drinking in the last 6 months. Normally, people endorsing this are going to have alcohol use disorders already. Part 2 is past difficulty reducing drinking in the last 6 months. And part 3 is anticipating future difficulty limiting drinking. Some people might consider me an expert in part 3, which is more for emerging adults, college student drinking. This is the measure most typically used. I do want to give a shout out to Courtney Vaughn, who found that trait impaired control is actually pretty well associated with pumping more alcohol in your veins with an IV. Much to my chagrin, however, in Courtney's very seminal work, she only looked at part 1 and part 2, and I really wanted to see what part 3 was doing, but it is really important stuff. And so I want you guys to be aware of that, because these trait measures really are linked to real behaviors, such as, hey, I'm gonna pump more alcohol in my veins. My good friend Chris Kaler from Brown University, way back in 1995, recognized there was limited research on loss of control over alcohol use. If you ask him today, 2.5 decades later, he's going to tell you the same thing. There's limited research on loss of control over alcohol use, and we need more. Tammy Chung and Chris Martin in 2002 introduced the concept of drinking larger amounts than intended and for longer than intended. Other investigators made the presumption that impairment of general inhibitory control may contribute to the specific inability to control substance use. So there is some debate whether or not impulsivity and impaired control are the same or different constructs. In my own lab for the last 2 decades, I have been considering impaired control to be more specific to the drinking context, where impulsivity is a more generalized construct. So impaired control has been characterized as impulsivity specific to the drinking context in much of my writing. Now, I have to give a nod to Bickle and Marsh, who made the distinction between impulsivity and impaired control, and I really like this, and it's not incompatible with how I'm defining it. Bickle has said that with impulsivity, there literally is no intention to limit consumption. But with impaired control, there is an intention to limit consumption. This is, you go into a party situation and you intend to only have 1 or 2 drinks that night and you leave sloshed, but you violated your intention. I do want to show you some, this is Dr. Corbin's data longitudinally. So he's got some data where he's looking at it baseline in 6 months. We are finding a lot of similarities with Vijay Ramachani's work, where positive urgency is associated with impaired control part 2 more strongly than negative urgency. And so that's something to keep in mind, that it's, you know, doing rash things when you're feeling good is associated with impaired control. The other thing to notice about this longitudinal model that I don't want to spend much time with is just that even though you've got really strong measures like the timeline follow back and alcohol related consequences, impaired control is still predicting over and above longitudinally. And so it is a unique construct. It is a unique drinking outcome construct. So our research questions for today really are going to address the following. Does stress cause individuals to lose control over their drinking? Does a priming dose matter? Does your cisgender status matter? If you're unfamiliar with the term cisgender, this means that you were on your birth certificate, it said female and you feel like a female. Or on your birth certificate, it said male and you feel like you are a male. You identify as a male. So we're limited to cisgender only. Will drinking be impacted during ad libitum by one's childhood trauma and maltreatment history or not? I'm really into the self-medication model, and this is the idea that if you've had a rough experience, you may seek out a drink for alcohol's anxiolytic properties. So the idea is you've had a rough experience at work or at school, or, with your in-laws or whatever, and you come home and you want to take the edge off. And so the idea here is you experience stress, maybe you would drink more. So think about the pandemic, having to work at home and, do the dishes and also, have dueling Zoom meetings and all these kinds of things. So the idea here is stressor first, then drinking. In the corner there, you can see a picture of Sophia, hopefully. She was interested in looking at loneliness. Oddly, before the pandemic hit, we collected this data. And so I just want to point out that cross-sectionally, we have found with perceived stress in the last month that it is related to impaired control part 3 in college students. And so I'm not going to talk a lot about this model. I'm just kind of setting up that there is evidence that there's a stress impaired control link. And I want you to remember that this link right here between stress and impaired control, the Z-score is of 4.428, okay? Now, when you look at this from a latent variable model, there's something kind of interesting we need to think about, because in Sophia's model, these are observed variables, so you're looking at mean scores, okay? When you look at a latent variable model, the different items of a measure are going to load differently. So you can see like item 3 loads pretty high at 0.791, and item 10, which is a reverse scored item, loads at 0.209. So the construct is actually being informed more by the items that load higher or lower. And so we did another test of this in a different data set, looking at the link between stress and impaired control with latent variable models. So a quantitative graduate student I work with, Felix Munoz, he used stress and impaired control as latent variable models in a bigger model. And I want you to notice that the prediction increased. The Z-score went from a 4 to 6.264 with the latent variable models. So if you're looking at these constructs, if you use a latent variable model, you may increase the strength of your prediction because you're not using a mean score, but you might get hit in your model fit. So there's sort of a dance there, but there's a clear link, at least in cross-sectional, from stress to impaired control part 3, at least in my own data. And this is preliminary data, but we haven't published this yet. We're working on it. So at least from these really basic cross-sectional studies, there seems to be some association between stress and dysregulated drinking, impaired control over drinking. But what can we say, what can we really show that this link exists in a causal way in an actual experiment? The problem is with the self-administration evidence, it's controversial and mixed regarding the self-medication model. I remember when I told Kenny Schur I was doing a K on stress and impaired control, he was like, oh, stay away from that. Melissa Siders didn't find it, because we all love Melissa Siders' work. And so some studies have shown that social drinkers consume more alcohol immediately following a psychosocial stressor, while others show no increase in consumption after a stressor. And these are huge people in the field like Merlot and Melissa Siders, who we all know are fabulous scientists. Now, when you really dig deep into this literature, you will notice something. There really are insufficient sample sizes ranging from 40 to 70 participants on average. So if you're looking for moderating effects, it might be challenging. There's insufficient power to really examine cisgender sex differences. And with many of these older studies, they never even studied women at all. There's a wide variety of stressors used: mood induction, shock, the Trier social stress test. Some use a paradigm in which very little alcohol, like 2-drink taste tests, are used. This is a methodology that Sanaa will use a lot. And so there's nothing wrong with using a 2-drink taste test. But I want you to ask yourself, how many societal problems are really caused by 2 drinks? Normally, societal problems are caused by an excess of 2 drinks in a 2 or 3 hour period, right? And so for me to study impaired control over drinking, a 2-drink taste test is not going to do it. Just to give some predictions and background, self-medication hypothesis predicts people will consume more alcohol after an acute stressor. Stressors are widely believed to trigger uncontrolled drinking when the stress occurs prior to drinking. Sanaa talks about this a lot. But her self-administration studies don't go to dysregulated drinking. They go to 2-drink taste tests. Duckworth et al. Suggests individuals who experience less stress exhibit greater self-control, allowing them to inhibit inappropriate responses. Clay and Parker suggest acute stress negatively impacts inhibitory control with the Iowa gambling task. The theory of disinhibition, this is Mark Fillmore, who is a consultant on my K01 grant, predicts that a prime dose would interact with the stress manipulation such that participants would consume the most alcohol and demonstrate higher BACs when they receive both the prime dose of alcohol and the TSTT condition. Clay and Parker suggest acute stress negatively impacts inhibitory control with the Iowa gambling task. Based on Fillmore's work, 0.065 prime has robust inhibitory control effects. Prior research also suggests sex differences in the effects of stress on alcohol. So this is George Kobe, the director of NIAAA's work himself. Alcohol use disorders have increased by 84% in the last decade among women, according to Grant's work. Women are more likely to drink to regulate negative affect than are men. Collectively, these studies suggest potential important interplay among sex, acute stress, and a prime dose of alcohol in relation to ad libitum drinking. What you're looking at here is what we proposed on the K01 grant. We assumed that there would be an interaction of a priming dose of alcohol and a social stressor, social evaluative stressor. And their interaction on impaired control is indexed by ad lib consumption when contingencies are provided to encourage moderate consumption, like only have 1 beverage an hour. We hypothesized an interaction between alcohol and stress such that ad lib consumption will be greatest under both a priming dose and social stress. And so the idea here is if you receive the Trier social stress test where you get the speech, here you would evaluate somebody else's speech. And you receive an alcohol prime of 3 cocktails, 0.065, that we would anticipate that you would dysregulate the most here. This is what we predicted. Now, with our method, we conducted a lab-based study with 210 individuals. We started off with 221, but had to get rid of some people because either their prime dose was too high or too low. We were really targeting around 0.065, or we had a group where only one person showed up, but it's supposed to be a group drinking context. And so we just used that as practice sessions for the research assistants, or somebody confessed that they had no intention of drinking because they had some really important appointment the next morning, even though they had promised us beforehand they wouldn't do that. And so that left us with 105 women and 105 men. Participants were randomly assigned to either a priming dose of alcohol or a placebo. Our placebo cocktail is basically 3 drinks of cranberry juice and 7-Up and some tonic water. It has that weird quinine taste to it. And then our alcohol beverage is basically cranberry juice, some 7-Up and vodka, based on height and weight calculations. And the Trier social stress test or the control condition, if you're in the control condition, you just evaluate somebody else's speech, followed by 90-minute ad libitum consumption in a naturalistic bar setting with groups of 2 or 3 people. So it is a group drinking context. I'm going to call out Rob Lehman's very novel behavioral impaired control paradigm from 2013. Here, participants were instructed to limit drinking to no more than 1 drink per hour to maximize their monetary reward. Basically, you're told, hey, you did some cognitive tasks before, you're going to be doing those again. And we need you to have like 80% of your performance. So if you drink too much, you have a probabilistic chance of losing some of your subject payment if you do that. So there really is an incentive to limit your drinking. I have this little symbol here because sometimes I mispronounce this, and I've had some German friends tell me, please don't do that. It's Trier social stress test. It's a laboratory procedure used to reliably induce stress in human research participants. It is a combination of procedures that were previously known to induce stress. In other people's research, it has increased heart rate and cortisol spikes. It's kind of an awful task. You basically are given 5 minutes to prepare a speech about what you like and dislike about your body, personality, and life. We packed our observers with the most attractive research assistants of the opposite sex that we could come up with, really symmetrical faces. And they give them no positive cues at all. Crossed arms, no head nods, no positive reinforcement at all. So when you're talking about your body, personality, and life, you're receiving no positive cues at all. It's really a daunting task. And then right after that, we give you a very large number and ask you to subtract by 13s in your head. And if you make a mathematical mistake while we're videotaping you, you have to start over. So this is to induce, this is the full Trier to induce as much stress as possible. The reviewers from Psychology of Addictive Behaviors asked us to do this, prepare this slide to talk about our how we did our priming dose manipulation. And so when you were asked after the Trier, you know, our manipulation is basically, hey, you're either going to get your placebo cocktails or you're going to get our alcoholic cocktails. You have 6 minutes to drink the first drink, a minute to rest, 6 minutes to drink the second drink, a minute to rest, 6 minutes to drink the third drink, a minute to rest. You have 6 minutes to absorb the alcohol. We walk you down the hall to rinse your mouth before we take a blood alcohol concentration reading. Right after that, we present participants with a violation of impaired control instructions. During an ad libitum drinking period, participants were instructed to limit drinking to no more than 1 drink per hour to maximize monetary reward. The violation of impaired control instructions measurements reflects when the participants consume more than 1 drink per hour. You could actually order 2 during ad libitum and not violate. It's just that you would have to sort of space it out where you're only drinking 1 in the first hour and then you wait after 60 minutes to order your second one, because you know, you can metabolize about a drink an hour. And so that's a safe drinking strategy, actually. The ad libitum drinking period comprised of 90 minutes of drinking period in which participants can order alcoholic drinks and self-administer freely until either a BAC of 0.12 is reached, or they voluntarily decide to stop. Once a BAC of 0.12 is hit, we cut them off. So they were barred from ordering any more alcoholic drinks, but we let them order non-alcoholic drinks off of our menu. NIAAA standards is a cutoff of 0.08 typically. We had special permission from both NIAAA as well as our IRB, given our level of expertise in impaired control on the team between me and Dr. Corbin, to do this safely. We didn't have anyone get sick. I was so thankful for that. We didn't have anybody who was pregnant. I was so thankful for that. And so we did have people that we would cut them off at 0.12 and they would still want to order more. And you just say, in 10 minutes, I'll take another BAC reading. And if you're okay, you know, we'll see if you have room. And people would come back 3-4 times trying to order a beverage. It was really interesting. What I want to show you is our manipulation checks. We did have these really cute little Garmin watches that would take continuous readings of heart rate. And so you can see that the TSTT manipulation, if you've got the social stress test and had to do that speech, that the heart rate really did increase right after the speech versus the control condition. Also, we looked at state anxiety. So state anxiety was measured after the acute stressor was administered. Participants in the TSTT condition had significantly higher mean state anxiety following the Trier, mean of 35, compared to those in the no TSTT condition, a mean of around 27. Women had significantly higher mean state anxiety overall, regardless of condition. This main effect on state anxiety was modified by a significant interaction of TSTT condition by cisgender, such that women in the Trier social stress test were having means around 40 while the other groups were experiencing means between 27 and 30. And so the social evaluative stressor was actually more impactful for women, at least in state anxiety. For our data analytics strategy, each group of participants was randomly assigned to the same experimental condition, stress or prime. So if you came in with a group of 3 people to drink that day, everybody received the Trier or the no TSTT condition control, or everybody received the placebo expectancy beverage, or everybody received the alcoholic beverage. So as a group, you got the same manipulation. To account for clustering of the data, we utilized multi-level models to account for the fact that individuals were nested within groups of 2 to 3 people in a naturalistic bar lab context. Analysis were performed in SAS using the mixed procedure for continuous outcomes and the Glimix procedure with adaptive Gaussian quadrature for count and binary outcomes. We specified a logic link function distribution concerning the behavioral impaired control instruction violations primary outcome variables. I want to be clear to any students in the audience, if you're going to do multi-level modeling drinking context, I would stick with continuous outcome variables. Binary outcomes are really kind of dicey in the context. So we did have some covariates. We used the participants' typical drinking quantity per drinking event to control for how much they normally drink. We also used depression and anxiety sensitivity based on Conrad's work in 2006 as potential covariates. Interclass correlation coefficients were calculated using a random intercepts model for each outcome variable. Generally, values of 0.05 or 0.10 are considered large enough to justify the use of multi-level models. We had a variety of outcome variables. These outcome variables, their ICCs range from 0.37 to 0.44. So we definitely needed to use multi-level modeling to look at our data. So this first slide you're going to see here really is our outcome. It's a count variable. This is number of standard drinks ordered during ad libitum. And you can see that basically, if you got the Trier social stress test in yellow here, that people who got the stress condition, the acute stressor, drank more, and then men drank more than women overall. And so we had this main effect of the Trier social stress test on number of drinks ordered. This is standard drinks and not just like milliliters of alcohol or little Dixie cups. These are actual full standard drinks. So if you got the Trier social stress test, you drank 0.407 more, you ordered 0.407 more drinks on average in the stress condition than in the no stress condition. And men ordered 2.65 drinks and women 1.85. Now, this next variable is a violation of impaired control over drinking instruction outcome variable. And so basically, did you order more than 1 drink in the first 60 minutes or not? And so people in the acute stressor condition did violate instructions more. So we found that participants in the TSTD condition were more likely to violate the behavioral impaired control instructions to limit to no more than 1 drink per hour during ad lib. Approximately 66% of those who received the TSTT violated our instructions to limit, compared to only around 55% in the control condition. Although men at approximately 69% were more likely to violate the impaired control instructions than women at 52%, we hit the dreaded 0.06 on this effect. And so I believe it's real, but it could pop over the other way. So someone would have to replicate that to see if that was the case. The next variable I want to show you is peak BAC obtained during ad libitum. What was your highest blood alcohol concentration during ad libitum? And so there's a main effect of the Trier social stress test, and then we have an interaction of the Trier condition by the alcohol priming dose by sex. Now, when you get this out of SAS, it kind of looks like this. And so I want to make this a little bit easier to see. And so I redrew it like how I like to see things, three-way interactions in a journal article. And so on the bottom here, you might recognize this pattern. So here's blood alcohol concentration from 0.05 to 0.095. People who got the Trier social stress test, who happen to be men, who received the alcohol prime, we get the nice interaction effect, just like Mark Fillmore's research would predict. Okay, but I want to remind you that most of the classic research in alcohol self-administration, most of the studies, if you look at how many women are in the studies, there's very few women studied. And so, you know, it's not surprising that all of our theoretical predictions that are based on samples of men, actually our predictions are coming out for men just as we proposed in the K. But something weird happens when you look at women. So if they had an alcohol prime on board, you know, they're ordering about a drink more, okay, during ad libitum. So they already have 3 drinks on board, they would order a 4th. That's already heavy episodic drinking for women. But if they just got the stressor, so all they had was the cranberry juice cocktails with 7-Up and quinine water, like tonic water, didn't receive any pharmacological alcohol at all. But they got the acute stressor. The difference between 0.05 and 0.07 is like a full standard drink. So the acute stressor was really impacting women. Now, there's a couple of really behavioral pharmacologists in the audience. And so if you're not one of those and you want to zone out here for a second, it's okay. This is really meant for the other pharmacologists in the room. We also looked at a change score. So, you know, what was your peak BAC, but we subtracted out what your BAC was at the start of ad libitum because some of our participants had a prime dose. And so this is actually a stronger outcome variable, but it's a change score. So how much did your BAC change from the start of ad libitum? You may or may not have a 0.065 prime dose on board or not. And then, you know, how much did you continue to drink after that? Even though we had a mean of 0.065 exactly on target for the sample, there are individual differences. People are higher or lower. You know, the mean is, you know, across many participants and not just one. So you do have a main effect of the Trier condition, a main effect of alcohol. Obviously, if you had the 3-drink prime dose, people drank less during ad libitum because they already had 3 drinks on board. Males drink more, and you see that 3-way interaction again. And so I'm going to leave this in the SAS outcome. So if you were a woman, and so this is, you were in the Trier social stress test control condition, and here you received the Trier. If you did not receive the alcohol prime, and you were in the Trier condition, and you happen to be female, that's almost a 0.02 difference is like a full standard drink difference. So that stress is really moving women. Now, the guys who didn't have alcohol on board already, you know, they're going between 2 and 3 drinks. But if they have the Trier social stress test, what happens is basically they've got the alcohol prime on board, so they already have 0.065. They're showing movement, sorry. And so from a little bit higher than 0.02 to a little bit higher than 0.04 is about a standard drink difference there. They're being more moved by both having the prime dose and the stressor. So just in some conclusions for this part, and then we're going to go on to the trauma aspects of this research. The relationship between stress and alcohol consumption is highly complex. More research on the context in which people exceed their own limits for drinking is needed. We need to use large enough sample sizes to meaningfully study sex differences and beyond. We need to systematically study different types of stressors. You know, having people anticipate a shock like Merlot did was not effective. Narrative mood inductions didn't move people very much for this particular type of research, but a socio-evaluative stressor was really impactful for women. I've had some social psychologists who are evolutionary based tell me that men are going to be more impacted by independence threats. The only way to determine that is to test it. And so you could change your manipulation for the acute stressor and see which ones are impacting men versus women, et cetera. And that work needs to be done. There is some evidence to suggest those independence threats really are more impactful for men. Takeaway messages: stress is linked with dysregulated drinking or impaired control in cross-sectional structural equation models, at least with impaired control part 3 in college students, latent variable measurement models, and experiments allowing for causal inferences to be made within a social drinking context. Given that women only needed to receive the acute stressor, this may suggest that the self-medication model of alcohol addiction may need to be revised to account for cisgender sex differences. I got to be honest with you. I think the self-medication model is a beautiful, beautiful model. It has inspired a lot of my work. However, I think that we have work to be done yet for the nuances to involve gender differences or sex differences, pardon me. This next part of the talk is really exploratory. What you saw before was specific aim 1 of my KO1 grant. And I'm sort of known for my work on parenting styles and bonds. I am the person who took the parenting styles measure and broke it apart and asked questions separately for mothers and fathers. And so that was a big to do, probably 15 years ago or something like that. And so there's a lot of research and a lot of publications on parenting styles and bonds. And what this led to is working with a student, Mia Medina, on a bullying model. And then also my student, Danny Belton, who works at the Mayo Clinic right now, who is still publishing with us. He is really interested in childhood maltreatment and trauma variables. And so, we our work has kind of turned to that direction because to me, like parenting styles and bonds are sort of mild compared to childhood maltreatment. And so this has led to some work on trauma. The ones that are in red, the top 3 there, Sean's, Tessa's, and Danny's models, we've already published some models on trauma, looking at the indirect relationships to impaired control. And then we have those that are in black are in process. And, I want to give a shout out to some of my other students that might be on this symposium talk call, so they can see that their work is still up there, and I haven't forgotten about you, Elena. Okay. So this work on trauma has sort of gotten me interested in, there's perceived stress in the last month, right? But there's also like acute chronic stress that you could have. And if you want to think about the war in Ukraine, let's think about these poor kiddos who are losing they have to say goodbye to their dad. They've lost their home. They've lost their toys. They've lost most of their clothes. They've lost their friends. They've lost their schools, and they're being disrupted and maybe moving to a country where they don't know the language. To me, that isn't anyone's fault. Okay. It's not the child's fault. They may have the most loving parents on the planet, and still that would be a stress that you would experience. So I'm interested in this idea of allostatic load, the effects of chronic stress and the wear and tear on the body from accumulating negative events. Both chronic stress and childhood trauma have been associated with increased risk for alcohol use disorders. The most common form of childhood trauma is emotional abuse among college students. The self-medication model predicts that individuals drink to alleviate the negative emotions they feel after a stressful life event occurs. Yet laboratory investigations have yielded those mixed results that I talked about previously. Some people are finding effects of an acute stressor in self-administration models will impact your ad libitum drinking, and other paradigms have not. It's great work. It's just, you've got what manipulation are we talking about? Our sample consisted of 210 participants. This is the same sample, basically. I'm just going to talk about some new variables. So 105 women, 105 men. So we had a design of, cisgender sex, by two stress conditions. So you either get the TSDT or you don't. And either you get a placebo at 0.00 or 0.065. And we examined whether these interacted with allostatic load and childhood trauma facets prior to age 12. So we sought to explore if childhood maltreatment history would interact with allostatic load to determine if an acute stress event is an important moderator of these relationships on ad libitum drinking. We predicted that those with higher allostatic loads and childhood maltreatment histories would drink the most after the Trier social stress test. We use the CTQ, and the CTQ has several dimensions to it: emotional abuse, people in my family said hurtful or insulting things to me; physical abuse, people in my family hit me so hard it left me with bruises or marks; sexual abuse is someone tried to touch me inappropriately; physical neglect is I didn't have enough to eat, I had to wear dirty clothes, you weren't taken to the doctor. The CTQ really has a lack of emotional support. However, if you look at all of the items carefully, every single item is valenced to be support. So I knew there was someone to take care of me and protect me. It's really an emotionally supportive family members. So I left it as support. So please don't be confused by that. The items are actually stated like support. And so we use the life events checklist. This is 46 items that most normal people would consider to be stressful. The sum scores, so you just kind of add up how many of these events have you had, are supposed to indicate the wear and tear of the body. Items on this measure include things like you had to move to a new home, your parents are arguing, your parents divorced, there was the death of a family member, one of your family members has a very serious illness, a parent has lost a job, there's trouble with the police, you have trouble with classmates, you didn't make an athletic team, school suspension, you've had a serious injury. Now, I'm kind of a psychometric snob. I'm Roger Millsap student. And Mike Edwards, the student, we're very psychometrically savvy at ASU. The alpha reliability for this measure is rather low, but it isn't a unidimensional construct. If you think of, I'm okay with this alpha being really low because having your parent being diagnosed with cancer is very different than having your parent arrested for a DUI. If you can think about those things, they're very unrelated things. And so they don't hang together in a unidimensional way. And that's really okay. That doesn't mean it's not a useful construct. So we did use the violation of impaired control instructions. It is the same study. I'm just kind of looking at some other variables now. So during an ad libitum drinking period, participants were instructed to limit drinking to no more than 1 drink per hour to maximize monetary reward. The violation of impaired control instructions measurement reflects when the participants consume more than 1 drink per hour. Again, the ad libitum drinking period comprised of 90 minutes of drinking, and we would cut people off at 0.12. Statistical method, I'm only going to talk about peak BAC for this part. I think it's the easiest variable to understand. Anything that would come out with peak BAC will also come out with that change score variable. So just be aware that anything I'm showing you here with peak BAC, it's actually more powerful when you use the change score. But I think for presentation purposes, I'm going to just talk about peak BAC. To account for clustering participants into groups, a generalized linear model was conducted in SAS using the mixed procedure and multi-level modeling for continuous outcomes such as peak BAC during ad libitum. What I'm going to show you here is basically that allostatic load does interact with our prime dose and Trier condition. And so I did use neuroticism, which is kind of a catch-all variable for you're kind of irritable and worried. And so if you have a higher allostatic load, which would be the life events checklist, and you didn't receive the Trier, these people are drinking more. You can see this nice main effect. If you happen to have a higher allostatic load and you didn't receive the alcohol prime, so you don't have 3 alcoholic beverages already on board, but you had a really bad allostatic load, they were grabbing for more alcohol. They didn't have alcohol on board, but they wanted that alcohol after that stressor. So I thought that was kind of interesting. This is with the error bars. Some people who are really into multi-level modeling want to see those. And so this is with the standard, the error bars there. What you're looking for is the separation of color. You want to see some of the color where it's not overlapping. I just want to kind of show you, I'm basically going to be using the same model and switching out facets of trauma. And so this is my multi-level model. And so I'm going to look at emotionally supportive families first. LSC is your allostatic load, and our covariates are right here. And so all I'm going to do is swap out this variable right here. So this is going to be emotionally supportive family. We find repeating three-way interactions with trauma facets. So emotionally supportive family by Trier, by cisgender. And so, okay. So if you didn't receive a lot of emotional support, you would be on this end of the graph or this end of the graph. And if you had high support, you're up here. Now, if you didn't receive the Trier manipulation, and you happen to be female, you felt more comfortable kind of drinking, okay? Now the women are in blue here, but if you lacked emotional support, so you're on this end of the graph, and you got the acute stressor and you were a female, you really dysregulated. Weirdly, the males who had support, they had the acute stressor, felt more comfortable drinking if they were more supported. It was a social drinking context. So that is sort of interesting. We get a beautiful separation here showing that women who do lack emotional support from their families are much more sensitive to that acute stressor. You can see that nice separation there in peak BAC. You know, this is heavy episodic drinking. You know, we're cutting people off here. As support increases, there's less drinking. Now, I'm going to swap this out now and show you emotional abuse. So same model, but here's emotional abuse. And there are two three-way interactions. So if you were emotionally abused and you didn't receive the Trier social stress test manipulation, you were in the control, you know, people are ordering between 2 and 3 drinks, okay, which is normal for that time frame. But if you were emotionally abused and you happen to be female, which is the blue line here, and you receive the acute stressor, you really dysregulate. Emotional abuse is really common among women. If you ask college students to report on their parents before the age of 12, they did feel that they were kind of verbally abused, most likely. And the weird thing is the males shut down. And so you see this nice separation where women who are emotionally abused are really impacted by the Trier manipulation. Now, here's where it gets weird. And here's where theory needs to be developed a little bit more. So now I've swapped out the Trier for the alcohol condition, the prime condition. So what gets weird here is if you receive the alcohol prime, the males are red here. If you were an emotionally abused young man before the age of 12 and you got the alcohol prime, you know, I mean, we're cutting people off right about here on this graph, but the regression would predict that they would keep going, right? And so, you know, right here is about where we would cut people off. If you're emotionally abused and you're a guy, you are more likely to be impacted by that alcohol prime. It's not as beautiful as the effect for women because you don't see as much separation there, but the effect is still there. Now, I want to look at physical neglect next. And so there is a interaction of physical neglect by Trier by cisgender. There's also a main effect of Trier. If you receive the Trier social stress test, you did drink more. So looking at the physical neglect one, if you were higher in physical neglect and you happen to be a guy, for those of you who are interested in behavioral economics models, which I am very interested in behavioral economics models, physical neglect means you don't have access to food when you want it. You don't have access to a doctor, those sorts of things. This is a more common form of abuse for male children. And so if you're higher on physical neglect, even in the absence of the trier, so you're in the control condition, you are grabbing for as much alcohol as you can. What's weird is it's physically neglected women who got the acute stressor who are grabbing for as much alcohol as they can, which is weird because you would expect it to kind of the pattern to look the same, but there's cisgender differences going on. And so you can see there's a nice separation there. I want to point out that I didn't have enough cases in a sample of 221 individuals, keeping 210 of them, to be able to run a model on sexual abuse. On one hand, I'm thrilled because that means we didn't have victims in our sample. But as a scientist, then I couldn't look at it. There are effects of physical abuse. However, the facets of trauma that I'm showing you, if I use neuroticism, or if I were to use anxiety sensitivity and depression, and I change the different covariates, the models don't change that much. The appearance of it looks the same. But with physical abuse, things pop in and pop out. So I'm just like stepping away from physical abuse. I don't feel as comfortable with those effects. And so we're getting like 3 out of 5, or I guess. So in summary, this study reflects the first ever childhood maltreatment trauma history by the Trier social stress test versus control by a prime dose on ad libitum drinking in existence. 3 out of 4 dimensions of childhood maltreatment interacted with participant sex and Trier social stress test, such that women were more impacted by a lack of supportive family, emotional abuse, and physical neglect in the Trier condition. Emotionally abused men were more likely to be affected by the prime dose of alcohol. This suggests that conditions under which behavioral impaired control over drinking are more complex than originally suggested by the current version of the self-medication model. I just want to say thank you. And then I need to give a shout out because I had a slide in the beginning of this talk. For some reason, it popped over it. But I do want to thank profusely Ben Zhao, my program officer for the K01 grant. He has been absolutely amazing from NIAAA. So supportive. I also need to thank the Burton Family Foundation for funding our undergrads. And more recently, I need to thank David Prince and Intel Corporation for their funding, as well as Chris and Michelle Barwick and Cisco for helping fund our lab. But I'm open for questions now.
Great, thank you very much, Julie. If anyone has questions for today's speaker, you can put them in the chat window. It'd be the easiest way to handle that. So we'll give just a few moments. It looks like we have a question from, I think Richie raised his hand. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself, Rich, and ask your question.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for that nice talk. Can you comment about your decision? So it sounds like you're doing the sessions have 2 to 3 participants in there. So can you kind of talk about your decision to do that, and I guess perhaps introduce that, the presence of others as a kind of a noise variable, and whether that can be modeled in your data?
Well, honestly, we wanted to do something as naturalistic as possible. Most emerging adults go out to drink in groups. I was limited in space beyond 3 participants to fit in that space with 3 bartenders as well. So we couldn't have a bigger group. That would be interesting. I also think it'd be interesting to replicate this study with solitary drinking as well. But I really think that naturalistic context, drinking scenarios are really messy. And so there is noise. There's going to always be noise, but that's why we're controlling it for the multi-level modeling to control for that group. We're not using ANOVA to look at this. And the fact that there would be all of this noise in that social context and that we would still find those effects, I think is rather startling almost, because it would be kind of a messy thing to look at. And I think like people's drinking behaviors are messy. And so we should try to model things that are as realistic as possible when we can. And then balance that with the control we need scientifically, right? So you've got to kind of bounce back and forth. I don't know if I answered that well enough, but if you have more nuances to your question, I'd be happy to talk more.
No, I just want some comments about that decision. So I agree that we want to try to create as realistic a situation as possible. You're balancing kind of experimental control with ecological validity, I guess. So I was just kind of curious about that decision process.
Great. So we have a question from Tammy Gorski in the chat here. She's asking, can you explain again quickly why you didn't assess for sexual abuse? I believe it was due to low rate of endorsement, right?
I did run a multi-level model with sexual abuse. Basically, the trauma variables were not proposed in the K. It was something that I added because I was interested in it intrinsically. So it wasn't something we proposed to do. The thing is, normally when I run survey data, I'm running samples of around 1,000 people, between 700 to 1,000 people, and then you're going to pick up cases. We just didn't have enough people who were abused, which is a good thing. It's a really positive thing to actually analyze it. So in a bigger sample, we would be able to look at it. It's really an important variable. I'm sort of torn because it's like on the plus side, that means we didn't have enough victims. And don't forget that most of my sample, we did have people from the community come in between ages of 21 and 35, but most of our students are college students. And so these, we don't have the most abused sample available to us. Thank goodness, college students kind of have, it's not like they aren't abused. It's just that they have less of it than the general community. And so it's a worthwhile question. I just don't have sufficient cases to be able to, for a multi-level model to run. You've really got to have enough frequency for that to run. And so we looked at it, you're going to have blank spaces in your multi-level model output in SAS if you run the sexual abuse model.
Any other questions? If you have a question, if you're a panelist, you can raise your hand. If you're not, you can put it in the chat window. We'll give it about 1 more minute for questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any. What I'm going to do is go ahead and wrap up here. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and post this recording as well. If you are interested in seeing any of our other seminars for the rest of this year, we have one more next week or next month. Sergey put the link in the chat there to our events page as well as our Twitter feed. And we do have a newsletter that we also put out on a regular basis. So on behalf of the Coffin Logan Center, I want to thank everyone for coming today to the seminar. I want to thank our speaker. Thank you very much, Julie, for sharing your interesting work with us. Hope everyone has a great day.